Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of Galatians. And Paul is continuing his story because it's really early days in the history of the church, early-ish days. It's the first 20 years of the history of the church. And he needs them to know who he is, how Jesus called him, and also his previous dealings with the main players that whose associates are causing them the problems that they're having. This this notion that you have to be an observant Jew to be a faithful Christian, which is completely against gospel teaching. And so he talked about his call, about his time in Saudi Arabia, well, not Saudi Arabia then. The House of Saud was not in control. The Arabian desert, and he spent 3 years with Jesus, training him. He had 3 years of uninterrupted, undistracted time with Jesus before he was presented to anybody in Jerusalem. So, verse 18. 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas. This is Peter, of course. Peter, or Cephas, I should say, not Cephas, Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now he's calling James, the Lord's brother, an apostle. In what I am writing to you, I assure you before God, I am not lying. I then went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia. I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea, which were in Christ, but only they kept hearing, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith which he once tried to destroy, and they were glorifying God because of me. So he seems to be describing that period of time. After his 3 years, he went to Jerusalem. This must be the trip, based upon the reading of the book of Acts. This must be the trip whenever Barnabas himself took Paul around, introduced him to Peter, also to James, the Lord's brother. So these are the two players. These are the two influential people, leaders in the church, the two apostles that he met. The other apostles may not have been in town at all at this point. They may have been on missionary journeys. But he, for some reason, and maybe we'll get to understand that reason as we continue to read, it is important for us to understand that he only ever saw two apostles on that first trip to Jerusalem when Barnabas took him around and introduced him to people. And he saw Peter and he saw James. And then after that, he left. And there was a bit of celebrity attached to him. He'd been off the grid for 3 years, and then he came back. This guy went back to Jerusalem, his stomping grounds, where he had been the star pupil of Gamaliel, where he himself had excelled all of his contemporaries, where he had this future ahead of him in which he would himself have been one of the leading rabbis, one of the leaders, member of the Sanhedrin. He would have been his own Nicodemus, probably in a bad way, had he not had the Damascus Road experience. He goes back, and this person who wanted to exterminate all Christians, who wanted to eradicate Christianity, is now a powerful voice. People don't know him. He goes back to Syria. Syria is where Damascus is. So he goes back there, and then he goes farther north into Cilicia. But he was unknown by sight to the churches, but he was not unknown to the churches. He hadn't been circulating among the congregations. Nobody knew who he was to look at him, but they knew his name. And he was allowed to preach. And so there was great comfort, joy in the church that such a man had become now a minister of the gospel, and they were glorifying God because of him. I'm not sure I understand why it's so important to establish for him that he only saw two apostles, Peter and James, the Lord's brother. It tells us the great influence James, the Lord's brother, already has. We'll talk more about James when we get into chapter 2. But he has this enormous influence. I just go ahead and tell you that James, the Lord's brother, James, the brother of Jesus, who wrote the book of James, was better known um, among the Jews in Palestine immediately before the destruction of Jerusalem than Jesus himself was. Josephus writes a bit about James. He writes very little about Jesus, but he writes about James a lot. And James was known to be a very observant man, more observant as a Christian than all the Jews in Jerusalem. He was known as James the Just or James the Righteous, and he was such an embarrassment to the leaders of the Jews because they weren't as righteous or observant as he was, that they had him assassinated while Judea was in between Roman governors. And that's written about at length in the book of Josephus. So he was an important figure and a recognizable figure in Jerusalem and an influential elder and apostle in the church in Jerusalem, as we will see later on as we continue our study. Okay, we're going to pick up next time with chapter 2, verse 1. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.